Rachel found the folder while looking for David's passport, 3 weeks before their wedding, tucked behind old tax documents in a box he'd asked her never to touch because it was just boring work stuff. She wasn't looking for anything suspicious. She just needed his passport number for the honeymoon booking, and the box was right there, unlocked, ordinary. Inside, underneath insurance paperwork and old pay stubs, was a marriage certificate, David's name. A woman's name Rachel had never heard before, a date 11 years earlier. And beneath that, tucked into a separate folder, photographs of 2 children, both with David's exact smile, both clearly past toddler age, both, as far as Rachel could tell, completely unaware that their father spent 4 nights a week, every week, 3 states away, engaged to a woman who had no idea any of them existed. She sat on the floor of their bedroom for a long time, not crying yet, just reading the same date over and over, doing math she didn't want to be doing. 11 years married, 2 children, and somewhere in the middle of that timeline, David had met her, courted her, moved in with her, and eventually knelt down in a restaurant 18 months ago and asked her to be his wife. What follows isn't the story of a woman who found out and confronted him that same night. It's the story of what happens when someone decides, deliberately, to find out exactly how deep a lie goes before deciding what to do about it, and how a wedding, weeks away, guests already confirmed, dress already altered, becomes the least important thing on her mind. Rachel and David met 2 years earlier at a mutual friend's dinner party, and from the outside it looked like the kind of relationship people describe as easy. He made her laugh within the first 10 minutes. He remembered small details from conversations weeks later. He seemed, by every visible measure, genuinely present, genuinely invested, genuinely building a life with her. David worked in regional sales for a mid-sized equipment company, a job that required him to travel 3 or 4 nights a week, every week, covering territory across several states. Rachel never questioned this. It was simply the rhythm of their relationship from the very beginning. David home on weekends and Mondays, David gone the rest of the week, a pattern so consistent it had never once struck her as unusual. This channel tells stories about betrayal that comes from the last place you'd expect, and the quiet, patient justice that eventually catches up to it. If that's the kind of story you're here for, subscribe now, because there's a new one every week. When David proposed, 18 months into the relationship, Rachel's friends and family were, without exception, thrilled for her. He was polite with her parents, generous with her friends, and consistently, reliably present for every important date on her calendar despite the travel. Nobody who knew them as a couple had ever expressed a single doubt about him, not once in almost 2 years. Looking back, Rachel would later identify a few details that, at the time, seemed like nothing. David's phone, always face down, always on silent, a habit she'd once teasingly asked about, and he'd explained as simply not wanting notifications to interrupt them when they were together, an explanation that had sounded, at the time, almost thoughtful. A specific area code that occasionally showed up on his call log, always dismissed as a client, never elaborated on further. The way he sometimes went quiet for a beat too long before answering a simple question about his work trips, a hesitation Rachel had chalked up to him just being tired from the road. None of it, on its own, had ever registered as a red flag. It's only now, sitting on the bedroom floor with a marriage certificate in her hands, that Rachel understands exactly what she'd been looking at, and exactly how carefully it had all been managed. Once the initial shock settled enough for Rachel to think clearly, she went back through 2 years of small details with completely new eyes, and the pattern that emerged was almost unbearably precise. David's travel schedule wasn't random or client-driven, as he'd always framed it. It followed an almost perfect weekly rhythm, gone Monday morning, back Thursday night, every single week, with only rare, well-explained exceptions. That area code on his call log, the one Rachel had once idly wondered about and never pursued, matched exactly the region where, according to the marriage certificate, his other wife lived. The client dinners he sometimes mentioned on Wednesday nights had, Rachel now realized, always fallen on evenings that would make perfect sense for a man having dinner with his actual family, not a business contact. Even small, seemingly unrelated habits took on new meaning. David never used cloud photo backup, a mild inconvenience Rachel had noticed once and never thought twice about, explained away at the time as him not trusting tech companies with his data. She understood now that a single shared photo library would have made his entire second life instantly, catastrophically visible the moment she picked up his phone for any reason at all. The most unsettling realization wasn't any single detail. It was how deliberately unremarkable each individual piece had been designed to seem, each one boring enough on its own to never invite a second look, each explanation just plausible enough to close the question the moment it was asked. David hadn't gotten lucky avoiding suspicion for 2 years. He had built, carefully and consistently, an entire structure specifically engineered to prevent anyone from ever looking twice. Rachel didn't confront David that night, or the next morning, or even that week. Instead, she spent the following 9 days doing something that surprised even her, building a complete, verified picture of exactly what she was dealing with, before she said a single word to anyone. She started with public records, marriage licenses, property records, anything searchable that could confirm what the folder had already suggested. The marriage was real, filed, and registered 11 years earlier in a county 3 states away. Property records showed a home purchased jointly under both names, David's and this other woman's, whose name Rachel now knew was Monica, 7 years ago, the same house visible in the background of several of the children's photographs. School enrollment records, found through a parent portal Rachel accessed using information she pieced together from the photographs themselves, confirmed both children were currently enrolled, ages 9 and 6, both listed with David as an emergency contact, both, according to the portal's family information page, living with 2 parents at the same address David supposedly visited only for client dinners. On the 9th day, Rachel drove the 6 hours to that address herself, telling David she was visiting a college friend for the weekend. She didn't approach the house. She didn't speak to anyone. She simply sat in her car across the street for close to an hour, watching a woman she'd never met unload groceries from a car, watching 2 children run out to help carry bags inside, watching an entire, fully formed family life that had been running in complete parallel to her own relationship with David for the past 2 years, unknown to either woman until now. She drove home that night without crying, mostly. What she felt, more than anything, was a kind of cold, focused clarity, the sense that she was no longer simply a woman who'd been lied to, but someone who now held more complete information about David's actual life than either of the women he'd built that life around. The grief Rachel felt during those 9 days didn't behave the way she expected grief to behave. It came in waves that had nothing to do with logic or timing, hitting hardest not during quiet, obvious moments, but in the middle of completely mundane tasks, folding laundry, waiting in line at the grocery store, moments when her mind would suddenly present her with some small, specific detail from the relationship, a joke he'd made, a trip they'd taken, and force her to recalculate what that memory had actually meant, given everything she now knew. The hardest part wasn't the existence of another woman, or even the children, though both of those facts carried their own specific, heavy weight. It was the sheer scale of the performance required to sustain it. 2 years of relationship, 18 months of engagement, required David to consistently, convincingly present himself as a man building a single, exclusive life with her, while simultaneously maintaining an entire second household, complete with a wife who had no idea Rachel existed either. Rachel found herself, more than once during those 9 days, grieving not just her own relationship, but Monica's, a woman she'd never met, currently living inside the exact same lie from the opposite direction, 11 years deep into a marriage that had, apparently, never stopped being shared with someone else. That realization complicated Rachel's anger in ways she hadn't expected. Whatever came next wasn't just about her own betrayal anymore. It involved another woman entirely, and 2 children, none of whom had any idea their entire family structure was built on the same foundation of careful, deliberate concealment. She didn't tell her parents yet. She didn't tell her closest friend, who had already booked a flight for the wedding. She needed, first, to decide exactly what kind of ending this story was going to have, before she let anyone else's reaction shape that decision for her. There was a particular night, 5 days in, when Rachel almost broke that silence anyway, calling her mother at midnight with her thumb hovering over the call button for nearly 10 full minutes before she finally set the phone down. What stopped her wasn't a lack of trust in her mother's support. It was a clear-eyed recognition that once she said the words out loud to someone who loved her, the story would start moving on its own momentum, shaped by other people's shock and anger, before Rachel had finished deciding what shape she actually wanted it to take. By the 10th day, Rachel had made a decision that surprised people who knew her as someone generally quick to speak her mind. She wasn't going to confront David the moment she saw him next. She wasn't going to call off the wedding quietly, privately, and let him construct whatever explanation he wanted for family and friends afterward. She wanted something more specific than a private confrontation David could later minimize, deny partially, or spin into a story where he was simply a confused, conflicted man, rather than someone who had deliberately built and maintained 2 entire family structures for over a decade. She wanted the full truth to exist in a moment neither David nor Monica could later reshape into something smaller and more forgivable than what it actually was. That meant continuing, for a short but excruciating period, to behave as the version of herself David still believed existed. An excited bride finalizing wedding details, unaware of anything wrong. It was, she'd say later, one of the strangest experiences of her life, sitting across from him at dinner, discussing seating charts and playlist songs, while carrying a folder of verified documents that would eventually end his relationship with both her and Monica in the same week. She allowed herself one deliberate exception to the silence. A single phone call to a lawyer, not to file anything yet, but to understand exactly what her legal position was regarding the wedding venue deposits, the joint accounts she and David had already started combining, and what documentation would matter most if this situation became, as she suspected it eventually would, considerably more complicated than a simple broken engagement. Over the next 12 days, Rachel did 3 things quietly, methodically, all while maintaining the exact same wedding planning routine David had come to expect from her. First, she consulted further with her lawyer, confirming that bigamy, marrying someone while still legally married to another person, was not just a moral betrayal but a specific criminal offense in the state where the second marriage, her own engagement, was set to be legally finalized. This wasn't simply about ending a relationship. It was about a wedding that, had it proceeded as planned, would have made David legally guilty of a crime the moment he signed the marriage license with Rachel while still married to Monica. Second, she made contact, carefully and anonymously at first, with a family law attorney in the state where Monica lived, asking general questions about how someone in Monica's position, married for over a decade to someone potentially living a double life, would typically need to be approached with this kind of information, given how devastating and disorienting the discovery would obviously be for her as well. Third, she began quietly consolidating every piece of documentation, the marriage certificate, the property records, the school enrollment confirmation, the photographs, into a single, organized file, time-stamped and backed up in multiple places, specifically so that no single lost device or deleted email could ever leave her without proof of exactly what she'd discovered. Rachel made one more decision during this period that she'd later describe as the hardest of the entire process. She chose not to reach out to Monica directly yet, despite wanting to badly, on more than one occasion. Her lawyer advised that Monica hearing this news directly from Rachel, a stranger, without any legal or supportive structure in place first, could do more harm than good, both to Monica and to the eventual case against David. Rachel, reluctantly, agreed to wait, even though every day of silence toward another woman living inside the same lie felt like its own small betrayal. There was one night, about a week before the wedding, that nearly forced Rachel's hand early. David came home unexpectedly a day ahead of schedule, walking in while Rachel had the entire folder of documentation spread across the kitchen table, cross-referencing dates against a printed calendar of his travel schedule from the past 2 years. She had maybe 30 seconds. She gathered the papers into the folder and slid it into a kitchen drawer just as his key turned in the lock, replacing it on the table with a half-finished seating chart she deliberately kept nearby for exactly this kind of moment. He asked what she'd been working on. She told him she was finalizing table assignments for difficult extended family members, an explanation that was, conveniently, also genuinely true and visible on the table in front of him. He didn't push further, and Rachel understood, watching him unpack his bag with complete, practiced ease, exactly how he'd managed to hide an entire second family for over a decade. He wasn't especially paranoid or watchful around her, because it had simply never occurred to him that Rachel might be capable of the same kind of careful, methodical concealment he'd been engaged in himself, for years, with far higher stakes. After that close call, Rachel changed one habit permanently. She stopped keeping anything related to the investigation anywhere in their shared apartment, moving every document into a safety deposit box she opened under her own name alone, checked only during the day while David was traveling, never again risking a repeat of a moment that had come far too close to unraveling everything before she was ready. 3 days before the wedding, with her lawyer's guidance finally complete, Rachel made the call she'd been waiting to make. A formal, carefully worded letter, delivered through legal counsel, informing Monica of David's current marriage plans, the property records confirming their own long-standing marriage, and copies of the documentation Rachel had gathered, everything necessary for Monica to understand, clearly and completely, exactly what her husband had been doing for the past 2 years. Rachel's lawyer had strongly recommended against any dramatic public confrontation, suggesting instead that David be formally notified, through legal channels, that the wedding could not proceed given his existing, undissolved marriage, allowing the situation to be handled through appropriate legal process rather than emotional spectacle. Rachel agreed to that approach for David specifically. But she made one exception she wasn't willing to compromise on. David's parents, who had been warm and welcoming to her throughout the entire relationship, deserved to hear the truth directly, in person. Before the wedding weekend, their son had allowed them to fly in for a ride. She met with David's parents 2 days before the wedding, alone, without David present, and laid out the documentation clearly and without dramatics. His mother, according to what Rachel would describe later, went pale almost immediately, and asked only one question before falling into stunned silence. How long had David been doing this? Rachel didn't have a complete answer beyond the 11 years the marriage certificate confirmed, but the silence that followed told her his mother already suspected the true answer might be considerably worse than even that. David was served with the legal notice the morning of what should have been his wedding day, informed formally, through his own newly retained attorney, that the marriage could not legally proceed given his existing, undissolved marriage to Monica, and that both women now had full documentation of his years-long concealment. He called Rachel's phone 11 times that morning. She didn't answer a single one. He called his parents next, who, according to what they told Rachel afterward, listened to his explanation, an attempt to frame the entire situation as a marriage he'd been meaning to end for years, but never found the right moment for, with visible disappointment rather than any sympathy. What David hadn't anticipated, according to the timeline Rachel's lawyer later reconstructed, was that Monica, upon receiving the legal notification, contacted her own attorney within hours and initiated her own separate legal proceedings, both for the dissolution of a marriage built on years of deliberate deception, and for a formal report to local authorities regarding the specific legal exposure David now faced for attempting to enter a second marriage while still legally bound to his first. The wedding venue, fully decorated and prepared for a ceremony that was never going to happen, sat empty that afternoon. Guests who had already begun arriving were quietly informed, through a brief message sent by Rachel's closest friend, that the wedding had been called off due to circumstances that would be explained privately, later, to those who needed to know. Rachel spent that specific day not at the venue, not fielding calls, but at her parents' house, finally telling them the complete story in person, 12 days after discovering the truth herself. Her mother, she'd say later, didn't ask why Rachel had waited so long to tell them. She simply said she was proud of how carefully her daughter had handled something that would have destroyed most people's ability to think clearly at all. The months that followed were, by Rachel's own account, some of the hardest of her life, made only slightly easier by the fact that she'd faced the worst of the discovery process with clear eyes and complete information, rather than being blindsided by each new detail as it emerged publicly and painfully. David's legal situation became considerably more complicated than a simple broken engagement. Between Monica's divorce filing, the criminal exposure related to attempting a second marriage, and the collapse of his professional reputation once colleagues eventually learned some version of the story, the life he'd spent over a decade carefully constructing unraveled within a matter of months, not years. Monica, according to a single brief, careful email she eventually sent Rachel months later, thanking her for handling the discovery the way she had rather than confronting David publicly or dramatically in a way that would have blindsided her without warning, was rebuilding a life for herself and her children, difficult but honest for the first time in over a decade. The two women never met in person. Rachel didn't expect they ever would. But that one email, brief and careful, meant more to her than she'd expected it to. Rachel kept the apartment she and David had shared, buying out his portion using funds from the broken engagement settlement her lawyer had negotiated as part of the broader legal proceedings. She canceled the honeymoon, but used a portion of the refunded deposit to take a solo trip months later, the first vacation she'd ever taken entirely on her own terms, answering to no one else's schedule or expectations. A year later, Rachel describes the 9 days between finding the folder and telling her parents as the strangest, most disorienting stretch of her life, and also, somehow, the period she trusts herself most completely for having navigated. People sometimes ask if she regrets waiting so long to confront David directly, instead of screaming at him the moment she found the marriage certificate. She always gives the same answer. The version of her that found that folder wanted to burn everything down immediately, publicly, at the worst possible moment for him. The version of her that waited made sure the truth reached everyone who needed it, completely and undeniably, without giving David any room left to explain it away. If this story reminded you that some betrayals require patience before they require confrontation, subscribe, because next week we're telling another story about the betrayal nobody sees coming, and the reckoning that finds its way there anyway. What would you have done in Rachel's position? Confront him the moment you found the certificate, or build the full picture first? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes the most complete kind of truth isn't the one that explodes in a single furious moment. It's the one built carefully, over just a few unbearable days, by someone who understood that a lie this large deserved an ending too solid for anyone to talk their way around.